500 people signed up for this. So we have a very, very, very large group here tonight. So it is just a thrill to be here. Just want to say good evening. I hope you are all well. I hope your families and all the people that you love are well in this time of pandemic. My name is Deb Rose Milovec, and I'm here with Russ Petrus. We're co-directors at Future Church. The Future Church is a 30-year-old organization this year. We're celebrating 30 years. And it grew out of a vision of lay people and some ordained people in Cleveland originally who saw that the church really needed to become a Vatican II church in embracing a Eucharistic community, a gospel community where women and men truly share and co-partner in the leading of the church. And so we're going to celebrate our 30th anniversary this year with a song fest in September with David Haas and a look back at our rich history. And Russ is going to give you a little more detail about that later in the evening. Let me just tell you a few rules for our gathering. So we're going to be recording this so that everyone that can't make it tonight, and there were quite a few, will be able to see it and enjoy it later. This is the first of 3 nights. Tonight, next Tuesday, the 26th, same time, 8 o'clock Eastern. And then June 2nd, 8 o'clock Eastern, we'll be gathering again. I'm going to monitor it so we stay on time. We're looking at possibly up to 90 minutes. So to hear the stories, to have a full discussion, but I'll monitor things so we stay on time. And there's going to be a Q&A at the end. So we're just going to ask you to hold on to your questions and jot down anything that you have questions about. We did receive many questions prior to, and I've passed those on to Chris and Teresa, and they are going to try to address them within the context of the 3 sessions. So if you haven't heard an answer, an answer to your question tonight, you will hear it later on. So I want to start tonight with a prayer. Let's bow our heads and breathe a second. We give thanks, O God, that in every age you raise up holy, wise, and courageous women who lead us closer to you and to one another through their faithful witness, leadership, and ministry. May their presence in our scripture and history, in our communities and lives, increase our desire for the wholeness you planned. May their witness embolden our work for justice and equality. May their faithfulness inspire as we seek to respond to your call in our lives. And may they encircle us as a great cloud of witnesses tonight and always strengthening us with their prayers as we work to recover and reclaim their memories and their witness for ourselves, for our church, and our world. Amen.
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 So tonight, I want to just do a short introduction. I hope you all have your book. This is why we're here tonight. I have mine earmarked and there are highlights. But there are times when the gathering of women and their allies in the Catholic Church feels profoundly historic. Tonight is such a time. With no less force than Catherine of Siena, Mary of Magdala, and the Syrophoenician woman who challenged Jesus to be more inclusive, gathered with all of us are 2 extraordinary women, agents of profound change in the Catholic Church. Sister of Mercy Theresa Kane, whose life, work, and prophetic words to Pope John Paul II in 1979 forever fractured the stained glass ceiling that constrains women from full participation in the ministry and governance of the Catholic Church. And as a way of introducing Teresa, rather than list her many accomplishments, I wanted to just read a few words from Mary Hunt's book review that she wrote recently in the National Catholic Reporter. I think she captures Teresa very beautifully. Teresa Kane is a Catholic feminist with a powerful claim on the hearts and imaginations of all who want the Roman Catholic Church to be a community of sacrament and solidarity, equality, and mutuality. Given the injustice that Teresa encountered at the hands of the patriarchal church officials and the pain she suffered when her best efforts were not enough to thwart their raw exercise of power, she has every reason to be angry, even bitter. Instead, she maintains her trust in the divine, confidence in her own decisions, and an amazing ability to keep learning and serving, all in the good company of her sisters and friends. A bright thread runs from Teresa's welcome to Pope John Paul II through the Mercy's medical and political struggles with the Vatican, the doctrinal investigation of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and the apostolic visitation of active women's religious communities begun in 2008 are further evidence of the ecclesial harassment. Some speculate that both were meant to put the nuns back in their place after the support and the bishop's opposition of the Affordable Care Act. Others think that going after women whose lives are focused on helping those made poor and marginalized, those who are sick or in need of education, was a way to distract from the ensuing and unsavory saga of clergy sex abuse and cover-up in the church. History will decide, but if the way in which Teresa and her community were treated by clerics who refused to meet with them, lied, and otherwise pulled rank, there is a certain sordid desperation that is only now coming to light. It is costing the whole church dearly. Hunt rightly compares Teresa's prophetic call for justice with Martin Luther King Jr.'s call. She maintains that Teresa Kane's story is not over. Teresa continues to prod and inspire. In her 2015 speech at the Women's Ordination Worldwide Conference in Philadelphia, she sounded an even more confident call, addressing Pope Francis in absentia directly. She said, "Only radical at its roots, gender equality in the church and in society will begin to diminish the violence, hatred, and other forms of inhumanity to our world today." And on to Sister Chris Schenk. Sister Chris Schenk is a sister of St. Joseph and, of course, the author of Teresa's biography, To Speak the Truth in Love, a biography of Sister Theresa Kane, which, by the way, is a finalist in the American Catholic Publishers 2020 Excellence in Publishing Awards. The winners will be announced in May, I guess probably during this time when we're having these sessions. So we'll find out where this book lands, and I'm sure it'll be high on the list. And I want to quote Mary Hunt again in her praise of Chris's work. The luminous picture of Teresa Kane on the cover of this volume portrays a beautiful woman of calm, confidence, vision, and joy. Sister of St. Joseph, Christine Schenk tells Teresa's story skillfully in meticulous detail, rendering such a visage all the more remarkable. The list of Chris's accomplishments is very long, and of course, I have such a deep love for her as someone who helped me along the way follow her in this work at Future Church. So I'm going to have to shorten it a little bit to keep it within the time frame, but you should know that Chris served as the founding director of Future Church for more than 2 decades, 23 years, and her long and distinguished work for a Catholic church where all women and men, lay and ordained, could work as true co-partners and co-equals, continually flowed out of her prophetic vision for what the church could be, should be, and will be. Before co-founding Future Church, she served economically poor urban families for 18 years as a nurse midwife. Her 2017 book, Crispina and Her Sisters, women authority in early Christianity, was awarded first place in history by the Catholic Press Association. Chris currently serves on the board of the National Catholic Reporter and regularly writes a bi-weekly column called Simply Spirit. If you haven't read it, you must. It is simply food for the soul. Chris holds a master's degree in nursing and theology. So now I'd like to turn this over to Sister Chris Schenk and Sister Theresa Kane for the presentation.
Wow. Thank you. Really, you outdid yourself. So thank you very much. And Deb is too modest because it was the best thing that ever happened to me that she took over. So let me just say that. And now with both of you together, I couldn't be more proud and more filled with the work that you're doing. So thank you. I'm going to start out with just sort of some of the questions that came over. The first one was, how did Teresa and I meet? Well, we met when I was actually director of Future Church. She was probably the third or fourth person we invited to give a presentation in Cleveland. And afterwards, it was wonderful. Everybody loved it. Afterwards, every 6 months or so, I'd sort of get this telephone call. Hey, Chris, how you doing? I just want you to know you're doing a great job. And so Teresa was one of my very early cheerleaders, and especially at a time when people didn't all like what we were doing. And so to have a call from someone who is, at least for me, one of the icons of women's equality in the church was just incredibly encouraging. So that was the beginning. Also, I want to talk a moment about how this book came to be, because there were questions about that. And it really had its roots in, many of you know, my own story of being totally unbelievable that Mary Magdalene somehow ended up in Catholic memory as a prostitute, not the first witness to the resurrection. And after I found that out, I thought, gosh, what else don't we know about women in the church? Or women in Christianity, or women in history? You know, how much more is there? And then my 2017 book about the archaeologic evidence was based on 4th century tombs in the Vatican museums there in plain sight, with a woman with a codex, a preaching gesture, and biblical stories arrayed on either side of her. And right at a time when women are being told they can't teach or preach, and other horrible things that were happening in the 4th century as far as women are concerned. Now, it didn't stop them. And obviously they wanted this known beyond the grave. So part of the theme in my own life lately has been, how do we tell the stories of people whose stories won't be told if we don't tell them? And that's basically how this story came to be. So the next couple of years, I have been approaching my own sheroes who have gone before me and said, are you writing your memoirs? You need to write your memoirs, because we don't want people, 100 years from now combing through obituaries to figure out what women were doing. And so I asked that question of Teresa, and I forgot about it. We had breakfast together 2 years later, and she told me she had been thinking about this and she wanted me to write it. So it was just an incredible honor to do this. And so it's, again, along the theme of telling stories of women who have made huge differences, but whose stories won't be told if we don't tell them. So now I'm going to turn to actually the topic for tonight. And I want to start, before we get to Teresa's historic greeting to John Paul II, I want to give a little bit of the backstory, and if you'll bear with me, it goes all the way back to the Second Vatican Council, not the first. The Second Vatican Council. There were 2 sessions. The first session, no women were invited. The second session, thanks to the intervention of Cardinal Sunens and Father Bernard Herring, a moral theologian and expert at the council, lobbied to have women come. And lo and behold, at the same time, the it wasn't LCWR at the time, it was a Conference of Major Superiors of Women, had elected Sister Mary Luke Tobin, a sister of Loretto, to be their president. And they got wind that there was stuff going on in Rome. They're meeting about us over there without us. And so Mary Luke got on the fastest ship to Rome. And while she was on board, she got calls from the media saying, "Oh, congratulations, you've been invited to be an auditor at the Vatican Council." So that's how she found out. Now, once she got there, she was quite a mover and a shaker. She saw that there were many bishops who did not want them there, who disapproved, but there were what she calls a minority of good guys. She says, overall, we were either ignored or trivialized. So she's widely regarded as one of the main leaders among the 17 female auditors who were present at the council. I would say also that the Union of International Superiors General originated, they were founded out of those meetings. As many of you may know, they've been very influential in bringing forth the issue of women's deacons lately. So even though women's communities constituted just 80% of the world's vowed religious in 1962, no women were allowed into the committee that formed the document Perfecte Caritatis on religious life. So again, 80% of the vowed religious, and the other 20% are male vowed religious, were not allowed to be part of it, even though Cardinal Sunens and Bernard Herring advocated for them. So they were blocked by Cardinal Antonucci, Ildebrando Antonucci, and after he was quoted as saying, "Well, you can't come, but you can try again at the Fourth Vatican Council," which sort of gives you a picture of what people were up against. So one of the things, though, while Mary Luke is over there, she's sending reports back to all the sisters at LCWR. I'll call it LCWR, the nuns. And Teresa says, I just want to read a bit of what she said, that Mary Luke wrote back that they had attended all these committee meetings with the men, and one or two European bishops brought up the fact that they should be looking at the ordination of women. Now, Teresa said that was the first time I ever heard of it, and feels that in some strange way, it must have been in my whole soul all those years, because all of a sudden I said, my God, yes, I can be a priest. And this was my very first introduction from age 8 to the fact that that could happen. So another important person in the backstory here is Sister Betty Carroll, because one of the repeating themes over many decades was the Vatican's preoccupation with what women religious were or were not wearing. They wanted them to be in habit, many of the Vatican officials, and because of the Vatican Council saying you need to go back to the roots of your religious communities, what are your original charisms, you need to make changes in your religious dress. So many communities had been working on that over many years. And at one point in the early 1970s, the Vatican didn't like how far people were going with the changes. And Sister Betty Carroll, a Sister of Mercy, who was president of LCWR, successfully defended the right of sisters to choose their own clothing when, who else? Cardinal Antonucci insisted that they have to return to wearing the habit. But because they had those great directives from the Vatican Council, they were on strong ground. Okay, so that's a little bit of backstory. Now here's just a little bit more backstory. Many people think that when Teresa addressed the Pope about the full ministerial, opening all the ministries of the church to women on October 7th, 1979, that she sort of was just doing this as a rogue actor. You know, this rogue nun out there saying, shooting her mouth off in some ways would be the most negative way. Well, not the most, but close. In fact, her own community and the Leadership Conference of Women Religious had already been all over this issue for at least 3 years before the Pope arrived. And just to give an example, for LCWR, the Women in Church Committee endorsed the first ever women's ordination conference that was held in 1975 in Detroit. There were 20 religious communities among the endorsers. There were more than 500 sisters that came to that conference who had already indicated that they experienced a call to priesthood. And there were 1,200 Catholics, priests, sisters, theologians, and laity who attended. Also, the Ecclesial Roles for Women Committee in May 1976 approved a meticulously researched paper, The Status and Roles of Women, that called for women's ordination. It said in part, only participation of women in the full ordained priesthood will begin to create a church in which men and women can live together as equal partners in Christ. We know the urgency of the church's call to now open the ordained ministry. So that's LCWR. Now, Teresa was elected to be the general administrator for the Sisters of Mercy in 1977 at the historic 1977 chapter for the Sisters of Mercy of the Union. In 1978, she was elected president of the LCWR. So the LCWR had already done this legwork before she was elected, but even equally important is that her own congregation, the Sisters of Mercy of the Union, at their 1977 chapter, created this document called Our Relationship to the Church, which and overwhelmingly approved a statement of concern about the 1976 Vatican Declaration called Inter Inseniores, that said, among other things, that women could not be priests because they do not resemble the maleness of Jesus. The Mercy Chapter Director, however, said in part that the Vatican Declaration had, quote, failed to deal adequately with the meaning of tradition, the nature of the charism of authoritative teaching in the church, the values of equality and mutuality, and the suitability of persons as persons to represent Jesus Christ. One of the important things I think about this chapter is that there were many sisters who had advanced degrees in theology, doctorates in theology, Margaret Farley, Doris Gottermiller, Mary Aquin O'Neill, who heavily influenced the thinking. And I would just say this, at that chapter, the Mercies recognized that they had always owned their responsibility to implement church teaching, but they had never owned their responsibility to help change church teaching. So we'll do more of that in a subsequent talk. In any case, the chapter authorized the Administrator General and provincials to communicate this directive, this stance, to everyone, and told them to communicate it also with officials in Rome. And again, this is in 1977. Just a little backstory, and I know there are many nuns here, but there are many who are not. The chapter is the highest decision-making body in any religious community. It's the place where we try to pay attention to what the Spirit is calling us to and the directions we should take in the next 3 to 5 years. So Teresa, as one of the 5-member leadership team elected at this chapter, was actually canonically bound to implement the decisions made at that chapter. So we see that both LCWR and the Sisters of Mercy were very grounded. And so when we found out, the backstory is that John Paul II was coming to the United States. The leadership he had been elected in October of 1978, and he was coming in 1979 for his first trip to the United States. The LCWR tried very hard to get a meeting with the Pope, but were repeatedly denied. Now, mind you, they represented 180,000 religious women who were staffing hospitals, teaching, doing extraordinarily important work in the mission of the church, but we couldn't find, maybe an hour to meet with the Pope. So it's sort of a snapshot of, how icky things were. In any case, part of the reason they were concerned was because when he was in Mexico, the Pope really didn't understand the kind of changes that communities in the United States had made in the wake of Vatican II. He made several public statements that presumed that sisters were still cloistered and in habits, which was not the case. And they were just trying to save him some public embarrassment and to enter into dialogue with him. So unfortunately, that didn't happen. Now back to Teresa's part. Several weeks before the Pope arrived, Teresa received an unexpected telephone call from Monsignor Murphy, the director of the National Shrine, who was preparing the worship aid for an October 7th prayer service that was to be celebrated with the Pope with some 5,000 nuns. So it was a special prayer service for sisters on the last day of the Pope's visit. And Teresa loves to tell the story. She says, I said to him, well, he wanted her title, her official title. And Teresa said, well, could I ask why you want it? He said, well, yes, you're giving the greeting to the Holy Father in the shrine on Sunday when he talks to the sisters. And I said, Monsignor, this is the first I've heard of it. How long is this greeting supposed to be? And it was, and he replied, it's supposed to be very short, sister. They're not coming to hear you. They're coming to hear the Holy Father. And Teresa says it was right in my heart to say, well, I know that. I'm not stupid. So, but instead, she says, so I said, well, Monsignor, when is this? And he said, Sunday, October 7th. And Teresa then recalls, well, I was sort of tempted to say, well, let me check my calendar first. I'll get back to you. But she says if she did that, he probably would have hung up. So another thing, so that's sort of preparation. Another thing in the works is that simultaneously, there were sisters and progressive Catholic organizations in Washington, D.C., who wanted to witness to the need for women's full equality in the church. And so sisters from Network, like Sister Carol Costin and Sister Nancy Sylvester, from the Quixote Center, Sister Maureen Fiedler, Dolly Pomerleau, and other activist nuns in DC, such as Janine Gramick, had been meeting and praying together for quite a while to work out how they were going to go about doing this. And so the plan was that we were going to have a blue armband around their arm in honor of Mary. And when the Pope gave his address, they were just going to stand silently. And so actually when Teresa and her family, when her family came, people were already passing out armbands and everything. So Maureen had asked Teresa if she wouldn't be willing to give the Pope a flyer and an armband. And Teresa very graciously said, Maureen, I really respect what you're doing, but that's really not my role here. So anyway, I love the initiative here. So as the day approached, Teresa herself was doing a lot of preparing and thinking through about, is this the time? We haven't been able to get a meeting. We have all of this important issues with LCWR and the Sisters of Mercy around women's equality. And she did decide to include it, this statement about including women in the full ministries, integrating, only though after and consulting with her leadership team with the Sisters of Mercy, as well as the LCWR leadership. She also consulted with Betty Carroll, who encouraged her to include women. Encouraged her to include poor people and the issues of poverty. And Father Peter Henriot, a Jesuit who co-founded the Center of Concern, helped her shape the language so that it would be consonant with the Vatican II language. So that was very helpful to her. Even so, it was very nervous-making for no other reason that 3 days earlier, the Pope had said no to women's ordination at the Philadelphia Seminary, sort of upping the tension around, oh my gosh, should I do this or not? So anyway, fast forward to the morning of October 7th, Teresa is sitting in the sanctuary with 5,000 other nuns, waiting for the Pope to show up. He was over an hour late because of his schedule. They had all been there since 6:30 in the morning, and he's supposed to come at 9. And so she had a lot of time to think about, oh gosh, is this the time to do this or not? And so she's thinking, well, if it doesn't look good, I still don't have to say it. So anyway, she's sitting in her seat pondering this, and the woman next to her leans over and says, are you the sister who's going to do the greeting to the Pope? And Teresa says, well, yes, I am. And the woman said, well, are you going to talk about women in the church? And Teresa's first thought was, oh, no, I don't need this. What if I say yes? And she says, that's terrible, And so, but she said, yes, I am. And the woman right away said, oh, I'm so glad. She says, I studied to be an attorney and I got no support from anyone except my husband. And then she turned to the lady next to her, the older lady, and who happened to be Cardinal or then Bishop Law's mother, Helen. So she turned to her and said, Helen, this woman's going to talk about women's roles in the church. And Helen leaned over and goes, oh, isn't that wonderful, sister? Good for you. So it's just a little story, but for Teresa, it was confirmation from the Spirit that yes, it's okay to go ahead with this. So anyway, so I'm just going to turn just a little bit. I'm not going to read the whole thing but just to sort of give a flavor. So when she was escorted to the podium by the Monsignor, and when she came, so just some parts of her speech, when she noted that, quote, it is appropriate that a woman's voice be heard in this shrine, the congregation responded with wholehearted applause. There was lengthy applause again when she pledged solidarity with the Pope in his efforts to respond to the cries of the poor. And she spoke of the contributions of sisters to building the church in the Americas. And then here's the takeaway. As I share this privileged moment with you, Your Holiness, I urge you to be mindful of the intense suffering and pain, which is part of the life of so many women in these United States. I call upon you to listen with compassion and hear the call of women who comprise half of humankind. As women, we have heard the powerful message of our church addressing the dignity and reverence for all persons. As women, we have pondered upon these words. Our contemplation leads us to say that the church, in its struggle to be faithful to its call for reverence for all persons, must respond by providing the possibility of women as persons being included in all the ministries of the church. And at this juncture, Teresa remembers that sisters responding with sustained applause. Peter Hebblethwaite, a veteran Vatican correspondent at the time, characterized it as thunderous applause, although by no means universal, since some older sisters in habits pointedly refrained from applauding. And according to Hebblethwaite, for the first time in his visit, John Paul looked nonplussed. The hands that were all set for customary modest acknowledgement of flattery moved into a deprecating gesture. And as the applause reverberated throughout the church, the pontiff looked faintly grim, said Hebblethwaite, and for a moment he held his face in his hands. But the fact is, bad acoustics and the Pope's relative unfamiliarity with English make it unlikely that he had completely understood Teresa's words. Another woman present, Sister Mary Helen Scari, who was a secretary to the Vicar General Associate for Women Religious, was seated in the sanctuary, and she remembers Teresa speaking, quote, and very beautifully in a strong feminine voice, and that there was a very light but audible gasp when the Pope put his hand to his face. And Scari had been told that John Paul often put his hand to his face when he was trying to listen closely. And she believes that the Pope's gesture triggered much of the speculation that Teresa had spoken out of turn. And the reason I even belabor that is because there was a huge outcry, a huge outpouring of media immediately. Teresa had not even expected that there would be TV coverage, but there was. It was a continuous loop, actually. Her greeting was on the television all afternoon. The radio story keeps coming up with none confronts Pope, which she had not confronted. I mean, it was very gracious. So just a little flavor of some of the media. Influential weekly news magazines such as Time and Newsweek published full-page stories and analyses. The Associated Press religion writer George Cornell's column, and again, it's Associated Press, so it's the wire, and that means it runs in every city and town all over the place, wrote that Teresa was being hailed as a new Joan of Arc. In this same Associated Press piece, the National Bishops' Conference General Secretary, Bishop Thomas Kelly, praised Teresa, saying she had a responsibility to make the truth known to the Holy Father as she saw it and to represent the membership. She expressed herself with great respect, Kelly said, and devotion to the Holy Father personally, and I'm full of admiration for that. So he stuck up for her. That was big. Another publication, a conservative tabloid called The Wanderer, published an editorial describing Teresa's greeting as a harangue and saying she had defied the Pope. And so it was very, a lot of that going on, and you can read all about it in the book if you want. But two other important pieces with this is that the Catholic Messenger in Davenport reprinted a story run by Religion News Service, which is again another syndicated piece that went out, covering a presentation by a probably the foremost biblical scholar of the 20th century, Father Raymond Brown. He was speaking to several hundred priests and bishops at 50th anniversary celebration of a seminary in Maryland. Anyway, Brown carefully explained that the term priest was not applied to the ordained priesthood until several hundred years after Christ's death and resurrection. Brown is a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, and he reiterated the commission's findings published in April 1976 that scripture alone does not exclude the ordination of women, which is different from what the Inter Insignores said. In fact, the Biblical Commission had concluded by a 12-5 vote that the church could ordain women to the priesthood without going against what Christ originally intended. And then just one more. So, we're getting lots of supports and from pretty heavy hitter people. Bishop Rodimer of Paterson, New Jersey, also said that Teresa's speech greeting called on the whole church to face the question of justice as it applies to teachings about the equality of women and men, and praised her remarks as respectfully made. But perhaps the most significant thing about what he said is that perhaps it was not the Pope's sensitivities, but our own that our sister touched in Mary's shrine. And he predicted well, because in the aftermath, a flood of letters deluged LCWR offices and the Mercy Generalate, over 5,000. And the non-scientific analysis from LCWR supports Bishop Rodimer's prediction. Every letter focused on just one paragraph, the request to include women in the ministries of the church. Overall, 2/3 of letter writers responded positively and 1/3 were disapproving. So despite the media firestorm, though, because everybody wanted her to go on, the Phil Donahue, they all wanted her on all the talk shows and everything like that. But Teresa decided she would refuse press interviews and speaking engagements for the foreseeable future. One, she felt that she needed to allow her greeting to marinate a bit in public discourse. And second, she had very big time constraints as president of LCWR and with the Sisters of Mercy. Her decision to avoid media contact drew some sort of, I wouldn't say blowback, but criticism from several feminist theologians, including Margaret Farley, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, and others, to ask her to reconsider, particularly in light of this big media moment. But Teresa disagreed. She said, before we start dissecting it again, everybody needs a little time and space to put it all in perspective. And Dolly Parmelo, the consummate church reform activist from the Quixote Center, admits to being disappointed that Teresa didn't take advantage of the media moment, but in the end, she saw the wisdom of it. She says it made her shrine statement all the more powerful because she wasn't doing it for self-aggrandizement, to be a famous media star. She did it purely out of conviction and out of love for the church and the people of the church. As for Teresa herself, she said she experienced a deep sense of peace after finishing her greeting because, as she said, it is no longer mine. It belongs to the public. It belongs to anyone who wants to hear it and to react to it. If anybody reacts positively, thank you. If they don't react positively, thank you also. It was bigger than I was at that point, she says. So it was enough for Teresa to simply put women's full equality in the Catholic Church squarely on the public table. Okay, so there was, again, some political things that needed to be attended to. The cardinals of the U.S. Cardinals were going to go meet in Rome in a month. And very quickly, the LCWR leadership made appointments to meet with all of them. So to hear their reactions and thoughts and stuff, which I thought this was very wise. To their credit, every single U.S. cardinal did meet with them. Teresa also met with the apostolic nuncio. And LCWR leadership themselves were ready to go to Rome in early November for their regular annual meeting with the Sacred Congregation of Religious and Secular Institutes, which is called SCRIS at the time. And they had already sent their agenda, but they soon received a request back that they needed clarification of Sister Teresa's greeting at the shrine. So that was the next moment to prepare for. And so I'm just going to, there's a lot about this in the book, but I think the thing that I just want to run through briefly, that Teresa did give a clarification, and after she recounted the fruitless requests of LCWR for a private meeting with the Pope, explained why it was important, reiterated the 4 points about her greeting: to welcome the Pope, to speak about the lives of the sisters, to express solidarity with the Pope and advocacy for the poor, and to speak for women in the church. And she closed by explaining the huge amount of positive publicity she presented. They had received and thousands of letters, which were being analyzed. She presented 100 positive letters from clergy, laity, and religious, and promised to send a summary. After she finished her presentation, a SCRIS member who was a sister acknowledged that she hadn't realized that people were actually affirming what Teresa said. She said, "We just received all the negative publicity." Turns out all the negative publicity they got was from one publication called The Wanderer. Whereupon Lorianne Canones, who was the executive director from LCWR and a powerful Latina, basically said, "That's a disgrace, that you're going to destroy the reputation of a sister based on this one publication." But the other thing that is even more significant is that Teresa recalls a sister member of SCRIS bringing up the whole issue of inter insignores. And she asked Teresa if she was familiar with it. And Teresa said, "Yes, I read it very carefully." And she reprised Cardinal Terence Cook's invitation to New York LCWR members to meet with diocesan theologians. And she quotes, and I quote Teresa, "In section 5, it says that ordination is a mystery of the church that requires continued dialogue as we move into the future. That's my understanding, and therefore I'm concluding that you want to continue dialogue on that issue," she said firmly. But the sister continued saying, "We want to make sure we clarified that you didn't include ordination, did you, sister?" And Teresa well remembers her heated reply. So I said, "Excuse me?" I'm giving a little more emphasis than she would probably, but so I said, "Excuse me, I want everyone in this room to know, and please put it in the minutes, that I included the ordination of women in my greeting, and I want it included, period." End of quote. When she recalls the interaction today, Teresa clarified that what Teresa suspects, that what they wanted was to walk out of the room and say, "Well, Sister Teresa clarified, and she didn't really mean to say ordination." And she was determined not to let that happen. So here we go. Here's this woman who does this greeting and then stands up to this Vatican office, the Congregation of Religious, trying to get her backtrack, and she won't. So who is she? Who is this person? We'll do a little bit here about past as prologue. Teresa is a daughter of Irish immigrants. She was born September 24th, 1936, which is the feast of Our Lady of Mercy. She's the fourth of 7 living children. She was baptized Margaret Joan. Her first vocational leaning took place during Mass, and her brother Patrick was an altar server and had to memorize all the Latin responses. Teresa remembers he wasn't very good at it. I would always sit in the front pew so I could help him. One day I was in church and I saw him up on the altar and saw the priest, and I thought, "Oh, I wish I were a boy so that I could be a priest." She says, "It never occurred to me to wonder why girls couldn't be priests." She remembers herself as a pious child, like not really fanatical, I don't think, but the church meant a lot to me, and going to Mass meant a lot. And so did the devotion connected with it. She remembers that from approximately 5 to 10, she made frequent visits to the Blessed Sacrament. At her first communion, she had a very clear experience of being in the presence of and in conversation with Jesus. She recalls that at the age of 11 or 12, she felt she would like to do something different with her life and wondered what it would be. But before graduating, she recognized a persistent urge to dedicate my life to God. And so for her, religious life seemed the only way to express that total dedication, but it was always secondary, she says, to the urge for total dedication of my life, years, and my very being to God. In high school, she liked business courses the best, even though they wanted her to go on for like the pre-college thing is how we talk about it today. But she insisted because she loved all the, business stuff. She had a very active social life. She used to sneak out at night after her dad was in bed. I'll let you guys ask her about that. But in any case, I just want to read this one quote from when she finalized her decision. She got this really great job at a Manhattan firm after high school. And she says it was a small office with 6 employees. And this is when she finalized her decision to join the Sisters of Mercy. She was alone in the office for much of the summer, she says, and found herself with a great deal of time to think. That was probably good solitude for me, she recalls, because it gave me the time to really consider what I wanted to do. And then one afternoon, she says, I went down on my knees and I prayed and said, God, I really want to know what's the thing you want me to do. What's the best thing for me to do? And she says, it just became very clear that I was to go to the convent and be a sister. And of course, it was much to the amazement because this is a woman who all through high school loved to party. And none of her friends could believe that she would do that, but she did. So, so she entered in February 2nd, 1955. She tells the story for 6 months. She cried constantly because she hadn't realized how much she was going to miss her mom and dad. At the same time, she loved the prayer experiences. She loved the Psalms. Sometimes she would wake up at night and just want to pray. She took great peace. And finally, just a couple months before she was to make first vow or enter the novitiate, she said it was left. It was like she had passed through the grief. She made final profession August 15th, 1960, and I'll just read a quick thing about that, if you'll bear with me, because it's very lovely. And she said this one was very early in the morning as opposed to first vows. We went in our church cloaks. She says, I think we prostrated again, and that was always a very meaningful thing for Teresa. And then we went up and pronounced our vows, and that's when we received our ring. And I remember very clearly what I wanted as my motto. Every Sister of Mercy has a motto. I didn't know this, so I thought this was charming. Teresa's motto, she says, was, my God, I trust you. And then she says, of course, I've been praying it for a couple of years, so I was very clear on that. So she was an administrative prodigy, really, right from the time in the novitiate. She was assistant to the president of Mercy College while she was in the novitiate. She became business manager at Port Jervis Hospital and became administrator at the age of 28. She was soon asked to serve on the provincial council and was elected provincial, which we'll do more of that next time. So I'm just going to close, though, with an experience that she had as provincial when she was in Rome. She'd been invited to go by Mother Regina Cunningham. And while she was in Rome, she often left the hotel early to walk the 4 blocks to St. Peter's Basilica. She enjoyed wandering around inside, she said, to pray and meditate and take in all the sights. She recalls an unusual prayer experience that she would ponder in the days and years to come. And she says, one day I went downstairs to the crypt and I was all alone. I remember going over and kneeling before the tomb of John the 23rd. And just praying and saying a prayer for the world and everybody in it and praying for our meetings. And she says, well, it wasn't at all a vision. it was just hard to describe. All I can tell you is that I'm there praying, and it was a voice, but I didn't hear anything. It was a message. And the message was that, quote, you are going to have an encounter with the Pope, and you will be a founder of a new community. Now, Teresa says later, for the first part, I always felt that did take place. And when the greeting for the Pope occurred in 1979, I remember I had gotten that message. But she puzzled over what had happened at the time. I mean, what could it mean? She couldn't anticipate. She did talk it over with her spiritual director, and who told her, you had a spiritual experience. You just have to live in faith and see what comes. And she found it very helpful because she, in the sense of not getting nervous or anxious about it. Her sense was that the message was from God, not John the 23rd, even though she admired him. So while today, the first part of Teresa's message that she would have an encounter with the Pope seems to have been fulfilled, she ponders the second part even today. And she says, I often think that I didn't found a new community by any means, but I certainly think that we have reformed and refounded our communities. We certainly had a whole refounding in terms of the sisters from Latin America. And I think I want to just say, I want to give my interpretation of the second part of Teresa's message, and that is she did found a new community, along with others, but a community of women and men committed to the full equality of women and men in the church. And I think that is one of the things that Teresa heard that day that has come to fruition and continues. So that's the end of my bit.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to do this.
Oh my gosh, Chris, thank you so much. How beautiful. So Teresa, take it away.
I want to begin by welcoming the many people who have taken precious time from their evening schedule to be with us for this presentation. Both Chris and I and our planners are most appreciative of your commitment to it, and we want to say thank you. I also want to acknowledge both Deb and Russ for their wonderful dedication to Future Church and to our church as a community through that. And certainly to Chris, we have become very, very close friends, trust each other, and have certainly great respect for all that women and women religious and men along with us are trying to do in terms of a new founding, certainly by many, many people. So thank you to that. And also, in addition to the people that Chris mentioned in 1979, the group of women who had the courage to meet together, to stand in the cathedral, to wear the armbands. She mentioned all of them, but one person that stands out was Maria Riley, an Asian Dominican, who was really a great leader for that event. And I've always appreciated that. I also want to mention my own family. Indeed, there were 7 of us. At the moment, there are 3 of us, my sister Catherine, my sister Barbara, and I, who continue the Kane tradition. And it is our privilege. So I was thinking back to what Chris had said about the 1970s, the cloister issue and the habit issue both. And Sister Betty Carroll, that wonderful Sister of Mercy, a visionary from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who originally was known as Sister Thomas Aquinas Carroll, and a great scholar in our church. She had indicated that up through the early centuries, there was no question of habit. There really was not a habit, but it only began to get present maybe in the 11th or 12th century. Also, there was no cloister. So by the time of the 15th century or so, both habit and cloister had become essential elements of the women only, the women's religious lives, not the men. And there was a great consternation about the changing, because at that time, the women themselves who were in the orders were very aware of the economically poor surrounding them, and they wanted to be present to them. So they needed to be out of the cloister, and there were times they needed to be out of the habit. So I bring that up because Betty Carroll said it's about a 500-year-old concern. So we were getting it again in the 1970s. And truly, that was a great fear on the part of the men who were primarily the bishops and certainly the Pope, that the women religious who had been in cloisters for so long, who had religious habits for so long, it was a radical change in religious life. Now, they didn't use that term, but they were absolutely correct. It was a radical change. And it was one that was deliberately made by the orders for the sole purpose of being able to be of greater service to the people whom we had vowed to serve. So that really, I think, in many ways, helped all of us to be able to move among the laity, to move into new arenas where we had not been before, not only in church, but in society. Women who then got involved with public life, absolutely essential for the quality of our lives together. And therefore, we find ourselves today looking at many arenas and trying to, in a sense, better our human community, certainly for ourselves, but for our futures. And in terms of my own journey, I certainly think that the women and men that I have been involved with for so many years and continue to be involved with have really been instruments of God's grace for me. Mm-hmm. And so many times I was able to ponder on the wisdom of some of the sayings that I heard and some of the conversations I was in. So as I listened to Chris, I was inspired, as I always am. And Chris was very enthusiastic about writing the biography. I know for a long time, not too long, but for some years, I had been asked if I would write it, and I never felt the call to write it myself. But I was asked by a few publishing houses if they could write it for me. However, I was not at a comfort level with that. And I think it was because I needed someone with whom I would be able to relate, someone I would trust, someone too who had shared religious life as I had, and yet at the same time was not a Sister of Mercy, but certainly in close touch with Sisters of Mercy. So it was really a gift. I think for me it was a gift and it was a grace. And I have met any number of people since then. And again, as Chris said, there were people who were favorable towards it, people who were not. And that's each one's right and responsibility and the authority to be at that place also. It's not my place to be there. But for me, the journey has been powerful. It has been beautiful, has been graced. I am in my 83rd year, totally retired, except that I do 2 courses at Mercy College when they call on me in the spring and the fall, and have had wonderful relations there. And also am certainly available for programs like this, which for me is an honor to do. So I think with that, I will leave it to Deb to say what questions we may be looking at this evening for Chris or myself.
Thanks, Teresa. Oh my gosh. 83 years old. Gosh, we're so blessed to have you. Okay, so here's how we're going to do the Q&A part. So our system is that when you want to ask a question, you unmute yourself. But this is important. Don't ask the question until I call on you. So we're going to try it. There's a system here. It comes up in an order. And so I will try to take them in the order that that they come. I may or may not get it completely right all the time. So don't be angry. We'll do our best. So we'll start with, if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and I will call on you, and you can ask your question of Teresa or you can ask your question of Chris. One of the things that just as people are getting ready to ask the questions, okay, here we go. We've got, let's see, so I am going to call on, it looks like Jane has a question. Jane, do you want to begin?
Deborah, I don't have a question.
I thought you were unmuted because you had a question. Okay, well,
no, I'm sorry. I'm fairly new with this, so.
Okay, that's okay, no problem. So I'll mute you again. Okay, and we'll go to Camille. Camille, go ahead and ask your question.
I wanted to ask Sister Teresa a question, or perhaps Chris could, but I wanted to direct it about back when Mary Mansour, a Mercy sister who was working in with the state of Michigan, and anyhow, she was told she had by the Diocese of Detroit to leave her community. I remember we all rallied around her, sent notes, wrote letters, became a partnership with the Mercies. To me, that was the first, one of the first movements. And if it did anything, it brought us all together, those of us that were working with the poor in Detroit at that time. And we basically were not the favorite child of the diocese downtown at all. And I was so touched by Mary, and I'd met her, and the experience that happened, but the beauty of the Sisters of Mercy who took her in and took care of her until she died. And I just wonder if Chris or Teresa experienced Sister Mansour at all, and if you could reflect on that. I mean, she wasn't pushing for the priesthood, but she was very controversial on the abortion.
Camille, that's going to be in the next session.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
but I mean, if Teresa, would you like, if we could comment on it briefly tonight, but we don't have time. It's very,
well, I want to say that, can you hear me? Is it
Yes.
unmuted? Yes.
You are.
Deb, thank you. I want to say I appreciate your raising that, because it's certainly for some people not in any way part of their experience, but it certainly has its history. And we are privileged to have with us Helen Marie Burns, who is from Detroit, was a provincial at the time, and probably suffered more than anyone other than, of course, Agnes Mary herself. But Agnes Mary was a very beloved member of the province and of the Union and of women religious. She indeed was courageous. She was very brilliant, was selected to be the director of social service by the governor of Michigan, and was highly qualified for it. And we were very pleased, and we endorsed it, as did the Bishop of Detroit at the time, until someone eventually said, as part of that position, she would be having to deal with the issue of abortion. So he immediately reversed his decision. But Helen Marie, if you want to add to anything to that.
So, okay. So let's go to Kathleen O'Hanlon. Go ahead and ask your question, Kathleen.
No, maybe I'm supposed to be muted.
Yeah.
I have
Oh.
no question. I think I
Okay.
have thing on.
Okay. All right. I will mute you. Let's go to Mary Pettis. Do you have a question, Mary?
No, I don't.
Okay. Sorry, I'm getting, okay. Let's see. We've got Susan. Do you want to ask a question, Susan?
Are you talking about me, Suzanne?
Yeah, Suzanne, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I do. It's 40 years later or so. So I'm curious, Teresa, if you were to be able to introduce the Pope again, how would you respond or what would you say? Because it's certainly a number of, how would you what would you say?
Well, thank you for that question. I actually was asked that one other time, and I think my response would be similar. It seems to me in the 21st century, as we now are completing 2 decades, that this question is much more urgent than it has never been. So I hope that my message to the Pope would show the urgency of it, would show the injustice of not moving in that direction. And what I refer to, and I do believe it, that what we are dealing with in our church and in our society are forms and expressions of idolatry. When we still continue to believe the male is superior and the female is inferior, we will constantly deny it, but we will live out that standard.
Thank you, Teresa. Let's go to Dot Malone. You have a question?
No, I don't.
Okay, okay, I'll mute you then. Dorothy, on Dorothy's iPad, do you have a question?
Yes, well, I don't have a question. I just want to say to Teresa Kane, I remember meeting her shortly after that talk, which left me absolutely speechless as a young sister, in awe of your foresight and your courage. But I can remember having coffee with you at an LCWR meeting with a mutual friend, Sister Sheila from Rhode Island.
Oh, yes. You I know well.
Yeah. Yeah. But what I want to say is, as a person, the way you greet people, your compassion, your sense of inclusion is not just something you talk about. It's who you are. It's the very fabric of your being, that you embrace all of humanity, all of creation. So I can say you are and have been my heroine. And I so appreciate your gift to the church. You are the Teresa of Avila, the Joan of Arc, the Mary Magdalene. You are.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so very much for that gracious sentiment. And I honor you and I reverence it very much.
Good. Mary Ann, you are on the list. You have a question?
Okay. I just have a comment more than a question. We've been talking about this, about equality, changing the church, being more active. In all the years, I don't see any difference. It's still patriarchal, and it's really ridiculous. We're putting up with such nonsense. But this pandemic is going to bring the church down, and new communities are going to form. And as the new communities form, I think we may see much more hopeful participation, because I think we've lost something. Once people got used to not going to church, that they're not going. And they just aren't. It's a bad situation, but the church has not come forward and helped anything here.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for that.
Did you have a comment, Teresa, to that?
The only thing I could compare it with, as you said, we're getting nowhere. Why are we doing it? You're absolutely right to raise those questions. But the only thing I can hold on to is women trying to get the voting rights in the United States of America. Do you know that they began that effort not in the 19th century, but in the later part of the 18th century? They began moving towards equality for women by having the vote. Now, they were not asking to vote them. They were asking to vote. They never envisioned being voted for, but they did ask to vote for the men. And that went through the whole entire 19th century. And it finally came through the beginning of the 20th century, 1920. So I believe that what we have been urging is being born. We're not seeing it, certainly. And then as you so well brought in, what is happening now with the virus may very well be the instrument for much greater reform than we had anticipated.
Very good. Julie McGree, you have a question?
Yes, I was struck in reading the book, the moment, Sister Teresa, when you had finished your welcome to the Pope and decided to, quote unquote, disobey the instructions of the Monsignor. Instead of going back to your seat, you went over to the Holy Father. Mm-hmm. I was just so struck by the bravery in that moment. And I wonder if you can put yourself back in those shoes and say something about what was going through your mind at the time.
Yes, and thank you. I never considered it bravery. I considered it courtesy. Mm-hmm. And I tried to explain that to the director. Well, actually, the young man came over to my seat and he said, I will escort you to the podium. And he said, when I come over, please rise and bow to the altar. He didn't say to the Pope, because I would have corrected him. He said, bow to the altar and we will go to the podium together. Then when you are finished, I want you to bow again and I will escort you back to your seat. So I responded by saying, Monsignor, I really want to go over and greet the Holy Father after I speak to him. He said, that is not allowed. Well, I did not do any response at that time. So I did get up, I went over with him. When it was finished, I did bow and I said, I am going to greet the Holy Father. For me, it was an act of courtesy, really. And my mother was in the shrine that day, but I can't help but think my mother would want me to go over and shake his hand. In fact, she said to me, oh, I thought I might get to kiss his ring. And she didn't get to do that. But so anyway, I would not have done it. That's all I can say to you. There's a great expression. I could not have done it. I really didn't. It was just part of my who I am, or maybe what I have been trained to do through the years. But thank you.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you, Teresa. Mary Jelinek, you have a question?
Yes. Mary Raymond?
Mary Jelinek first, and then Mary Raymond. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Teresa.
Hi there.
Teresa, there have been a lot of mentions already this evening about your birth family, and you just referenced your mom being there in the church with you that day. How did they react? And was their support or their reaction important to you?
Well, I was very, very blessed that I had 3 members of my family there. And I was going to we had a ceremony on Saturday, and it was at the White House with Jimmy Carter. And I was invited as president of LCWR and also invited to have a partner to come with me. So Sister Doris Gottmuller, one of my very good friends, was the assistant administrator. And I went and said to her, Doris, would you like to come with me that day? I felt it was something I needed to do. I didn't mind doing it, but I needed to do it as LCWR president, and asked her to come with me. And she said, no, I don't think so. She said, why don't you ask your mother? And I said, my mother, Doris? I never thought of such a thing. Oh, it would be nice. She might like to do that. So I did call my mother, and my mother was very surprised. And then later on, my sister called back and she said, yes, we think it's great for Mom to go, but one of us wants to go with her. Is that all right? I said, that's fine. So my mother and my sister came down to be with me for Jimmy Carter. And of course, then I did call the Monsignor at the shrine and say, may I have 2 tickets for them to come to the shrine on Sunday? Because I knew my mother especially would want to see the Pope. So I was fortunate I got the 2 tickets. And at the last moment, my niece, Mary Beth Gillen Burke, called me and said, may I go with them? And I was so surprised. She was a wonderful young woman in her late teens, and she wanted to come. And I said, you'd be most welcome. So she came, and she didn't come on Saturday, but she went Sunday to the shrine, and really was not able to see very much because she was way behind all the Pope and all of the delegates. So she stood up on the chair and she saw everything. So to answer your question, the 3 of them were in the shrine. They were very positive. My whole family was positive about it. And some of our relatives were not as happy about it, but I would say it was tremendous amount of support. When my mother went home that evening, she said, do you have a copy of that talk you gave? I said, yes, I have an extra one in my bag. She said, I would like, if you don't mind, give it to me because I don't hear everything. And some of my friends will be asking me. I gave it to my mother and I continued to say for a number of years, she's the only one who ever asked me for a copy of my talk. So I love that story.
That's fabulous. Okay, Mary Raymond.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I expected to have hundreds on, and indeed we have that. I have to follow up, though, with a quote from Monsignor Murphy, who was quoted sometime after this rude behavior of Teresa to go over and actually shake hands with the Pope. He is quoted as saying, she might have felt divinely called to say what she did, but in the Catholic Church, we believe in authority and discipline. The will of God was clearly reflected in the organizational rubric that she take 2 minutes for her welcome and then return to her seat. This is page 22 in the book. That was just incredible, incredible.
And I must tell you that Monsignor Murphy, when I did meet with him, said that it was a breach of Vatican protocol, that is something that is never done after someone speaks. They do not go to the Pope. A breach of Vatican protocol is what it was called. I had never heard the expression, but I've never forgotten it.
She wants to know. She wants to know what you think about Pope John Paul II becoming a saint.
Pope John Paul II. I think it has already happened, hasn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I did read a number of comments where, well, for one thing, I think it was done along with the Pope John, who else was canonized with them at the same
23rd.
time.
John the 23rd.
Having the canonization of both of those men at the same time seemed very political to me. And it seemed as if it might have been the only way they would have gotten John Paul II through as smoothly as it went. Otherwise, I do believe there would have been more controversy. But I guess when I think about the canonization, I believe that it's probably as much of an honor as much as anything else. It's almost how, because you're in that position, it's only right in some people's mind that, of course, you should be canonized. And I don't know that history, so I'd have to ask some church historian, is that true? Have there been many that were not, or does it seem to go somewhat with the job, to use that terminology?
I just like to chime in here in that I think it's very unwise to do it before it's 100 years after the person died. I mean, it was political. I think there was no question about it. And, I think it's just, I don't think it doesn't serve the I guess, the Catholic history in many ways to do it so immediately. I've heard from other people is that he's sort of like the poster child that you don't have to be perfect to be a saint, you know. I think he was a holy man according to his lights, but I also think he made some disastrous mistakes in leading the church. I mean, whether it's, you know, clergy sex abuse, however much he believed in Poland, you know, any kind, those accusations came from the communists, it was a smear job. And so again, because he had such a long papacy and really was not with the program very much the last 5 years, there are just so many things about it that were problematic. You know, it was a politicization. So
yeah. Thanks so much. Brenda Hepler, do you have a question, Brenda?
Yes. I would just like to wonder if it's a value or how you see us going forward, if we can get underneath the politics. I mean, you talk about the idea of idolatry in the church, and I think that is absolutely true. I mean, the idolatry, they can't change anything and all this sort of thing. But do we have a chance to move forward by looking at what's underneath? And if women bring up the fact that we are not even accepted as full human beings because we cannot be the full person that we are meant to be as a human being, is that going to help us? Is that a way? Do you see that as a way of moving us forward, as opposed to the more practical, concrete, this is the way the rules are, and change the rules? And I would just like your opinion on that, and thank you.
Yeah. Did you want Chris or myself to?
I'd like Teresa to answer that.
Yes. Thank you. And Chris, you're welcome to join in. I think as I look back now, I will say that when we began the women's movement in the Catholic Church, I remembered very well in the late 1968, 69, into the 1970s. Now, we also, as Sisters of Mercy, had any number of our sisters indigenous to different countries in South America primarily, but other continents also. And my own early visits with them is that they were not comfortable with our taking such a strong position on women, and they had not been used to it. But I want to say that once that they caught it, and somehow they did. They caught it quickly in their own parishes, in their own counties and their governments. They were absolutely on fire to move this issue forward. So what has happened in my judgment from then until now is that it has very much become a worldwide issue of women. It's no longer just, oh, that's your issue. That's what you're doing in America. It's going on in South America. It's going on in Africa. It's going on in Asia. And I'm only relating this to the Catholic community because it's happening generally also. So I really think there's explosions going on. I think we have been very respectful about how to go about it. We are protesting, but if we do, we are doing it nonviolently. And so for me personally, I'm not sure I will see it personally, but that's not an issue for me. It's just that it's alive and well, it's moving, and it's part of the 21st century, in my judgment. Chris, you want to add anything?
Just for people who think that we've had no progress, if you equate progress to ordaining women to the priesthood, I think there's much more to progress than that. Because I too have some hesitations about sort of adding women and stirring. We still have a clerical system. So what I see hopeful are the number of women theologians that are very influential and doing incredible work, getting at some of those underneath issues that you named. And, an explosion of lay ecclesia, quote unquote, as we call them in the United States, lay ecclesia ministers, but 80% of whom are women. And women who are leading based communities all over the place in South America and in Africa. So all of those are progress in terms of integrating female energy, perspectives. I mean, even Catholic Women Preach. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And what's underneath Catholic Women Preach? It's contemporary theological reflection from women who are theologians, biblical scholars, and it's hugely enriching to the Catholic community. It's taking a long time for this to seep in, but it is seeping in. So anyway, and I think it's harder and harder to escape the glaring reality of all men all the time, as so many of the streaming masses are making really clear to people, even to the priests themselves who don't like them. So it's hard to know how the present moment will change into the future, but it's certainly providing a lot of food for thought.
Okay, well, thank you both. Okay, so we are now 2 minutes before 9:30 or about that. So I am going to turn this over to Russ, who's going to lead us in a final, just give a few announcements and give a final prayer for us. And then we will be back next Tuesday at the same time. So if you didn't get your question in, you can get it in then.
Okay.
Thanks, Deb. Sorry about that. So just a couple real quick announcements that I wanted to make. First of all is next week we'll be meeting at the same time for the next section of this presentation series. And we'll be using the same link, same password, all of that kind of information. But we will send it out to you again, just so you have it. I also would like to invite you to join us in our online liturgies of the Word. Those happen on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. And on Pentecost Sunday, the 31st of this month of May, we'll have a special Pentecost service calling on Catholic leadership to stand with the most vulnerable among us. So that should be a special prayer service. There are a number of different organizations who are collaborating on that together. And if you sign up for the Liturgies of the Word, you'll get the link to that. We also have our Women Erased series, which is going on. We had our first session last week or the week before, and that continues. We keep adding new sessions as we go. So if you go to www.futurechurch.org, you'll see all those opportunities to sign up. So let's close with a prayer. As I was discerning how I wanted to end this this evening and what prayer we should use, like Teresa, I guess I wasn't hearing a voice, but I was receiving a message, and the words of Catherine of Siena kept coming to me. We've had enough exhortations to be silent. Cry out with a million voices. I see the world is rotten because of silence. And I thought of Teresa welcoming John Paul II with all of these voices, all of these women, all of these people behind her, supporting her. They were the million voices underneath her voice. And so our closing prayer comes from Catherine of Siena. O Trinity, my sweet love, you light, give us light. You wisdom, give us wisdom. You supreme strength, give us strength. Today, eternal God, let our cloud be dissipated, so that we may perfectly know and follow your truth, in truth, with a free and simple heart. God, come to our assistance. O Savior, make haste to help us. Amen.
Amen.
And
Beautiful.
So thank you, Russ. So thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Chris. It has been absolutely wonderful to be with you tonight, to hear your stories and to share in that history and to remember it together. So Russ is going to do what we always do at the end. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Join us again next week and the week after. And we're so glad you're here. And Russ lets the mics come off so we can all say goodbye. It's like leaving the busy room again and everybody saying goodbye to each other. So that's how we'll leave tonight. And we will see you again next week at the same time.
Thank you.